Welcome everyone to the first in the Jameel Arts and Health Lab conversation series. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us here today. We are very pleased to be able to present this particular conversation, which I'll introduce in just a moment. My name is Nisha Sajnani. I'm a founding co-director of the Jameel Arts and Health Lab and a professor at New York University. And I'll be introducing our speakers in just a moment. And my colleague Nils, Fietje, founding co-director of the lab and technical officer of the Behavioural and Cultural Insights Unit at WHO Europe, will be facilitating the Q&A and conversation afterwards. I'll introduce you a little bit to the lab by way of a short video for those who are new to it.
Loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the inability to express what matters to you most. And the arts, in all of its forms, was evolved to do exactly that. Loneliness.
So today we're focusing in on this conversation on what the economic impact of engaging with the arts and cultural heritage might be. And we're joined today by Harman Sagger, who's head economist for culture and creative industries for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, and Professor Daisy Fancourt, professor of Psychobiology and Epidemiology, head of the Social Biobehavioural Lab at University College London, and chair of our steering committee at the Jameel Arts and Health Lab, and co-author of this report called Culture and Heritage Capital, Monetizing the Impact of Culture and Heritage on Health and Wellbeing, which was commissioned by the DCMS. So I'm going to pass this first to Harry Sagger to speak to the reasons for commissioning this report, and then we'll pass it over to Daisy, and then we'll open it up for Q&A towards the end. So feel free to type in your comments and questions as we go. We'll be making note of those, and as possible, speakers will respond to them, but otherwise we will save them for the end. Harry, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. I'm going to put my slides on the screen. Hopefully that'll work. So first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to New York University and the Jameel Arts and Health Lab. It's been so encouraging that people have kind of seen the report and read it and really want to know more about it. So thank you so much for also your help on kind of sharing that report with the audience as well. What I'm going to be talking about is kind of how we got to this kind of commissioning this report, and it's quite a long journey. Technically it goes back 15 years, but I'll give you the short version of the story. So I think I'm going to go through some concepts which are probably very UK based, and I'd probably give you more context for what the report was, why we commissioned the report. So there's a very useful guide that we use as analysts within government. It's called the HMT Green Book. HMT, which are the T's for Treasury. And all policies that we put forward across government kind of use this guidance document to effectively kind of understand what the impact of policy is. And those who haven't read it before, I would definitely have a look at the first few chapters, because it's actually a really good understanding of guide on the kind of what we call the policy cycle, moving from appraisal to evaluation. What that guidance sets out is the need to assess the costs and benefits and risks of different alternative ways of meeting government objectives. And what this is really looking for is to help us understand the kind of trade-offs between different options and different policy options. And that's really there underneath that to help us make evidence-based decisions. The big element of that is what we call the appraisal of social value, also known as public value. And what we do with that as economists and analysts is we use that work that we've done, such as the report today, to understand what the costs are. And what we hope to do is put benefits on the same basis in pounds and pence, to understand the welfare impact on the population and not just the markets. And when we say population, the really important thing here is that we're very much interested in who is benefiting or who the costs are borne by as well. So this guidance document is a really good understanding, and many departments use this. Well, all departments use this document, whether it's transport or health, the health department. So what they're doing there is trying to understand how can we stack up these costs and benefits, and put across whether the public are benefiting from these interventions. And we've had that for a very long time in the UK, and many organisations, other departments have built into this with their own specific guidance for their sectors. What that guidance does, there's two things, the way you can use this evidence. One is obviously you can just state the evidence and say, look, this area is really important. This is why we want to kind of push for this intervention. What we do is we do kind of business cases, effectively. And those business cases have 5 elements: the strategic case, the economic case, the commercial case, and the financial case, and the management case. All of those are important for putting the case forward. It's not just the economic case. But in the economic case, has a very specific view, because that's where we lay essentially what we call the cost benefit analysis. Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
Reaction, and that was also safety.
I'm not sure. I heard something there, but I'll carry on. What that eventually boils down to in terms of those 5 cases are: strategic case really goes into what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve. The economic case is where we do that kind of understanding of the costs and benefits. Commercial case also wants to work out whether the commercial process and the tender has value for money. In the financial case, obviously financial kind of viability. And finally, the management case looks at, are we going to assess this and manage and evaluate these programs as well? It's worth saying, actually, the kind of word I've kind of used there is value for money assessment, and that is the kind of the term at the moment. It's quite an important term at the moment because some of you know in the UK we're going for a spending review, and one of the big messages that's come out that there needs to be a real look at like every area of spend and whether it's producing value for money. So what does that mean? Well, why did we do this? Well, because one of the problems was we didn't have and don't have specific guidance and values specific to the cultural and creative industries. And we thought, okay, that's something we need to kind of fix, because it means lots of organizations don't have the same level of values or evidence that they can use, such as other parts of government, to make their case. What we found, it tended to mean that some things were done inconsistently, and sometimes if it wasn't valued correctly, it would be undervalued, and in some cases not valued at all, so it's effectively valued at 0. And that's important when you're doing cost-benefit analysis, because you want to make sure you value as many things as possible. So what we've set out is develop a much more formal approach to valuing costs and benefits, and being much more consistent in the way that we do it. And so the aim really is to ensure that we value the cultural, economic, and social benefits, obviously, which the health and the well-being benefits play a considerable important part of that part. And what we're really looking at is that kind of social cost-benefit analysis approach. Now, what we want to get to at some point in the future, and these are things that we're building up, a bank of evidence of values for a range of cultural and heritage assets, supplementary guidance to what I mentioned, the Green Book, which is going to really focus on the cultural and heritage side. And when I say cultural, I also include the creative industries. And then finally, what we want is a set of national cultural and heritage accounts, similar to the natural accounts that were done. That's a much more long-term ambition, and hopefully we'll get to that at some point. Really 5 key points, though, is we're taking a welfare approach, so it's considering both the culture and social economic value. We're also going to really clean this is not just for the public sector, this is for anyone who wants to make that, can demonstrate their value. Also, it's when people affect culture, so transport and other sectors where they need to have our values to help them understand the impact they might be having on culture and heritage. Really important point is this is just one part of how we make decisions, and actually all the other evidence is also important. So it's not just the economic kind of approach in the way that we do it, it's also expert opinions, case studies, narrative, the wider evidence to show impact. This is just one way of doing it, but it's an important part of that argument side. And then finally, it's economics led, but it is completely multidisciplinary in the approach we're taking. What we've kind of been working on is kind of 3 prongs. I won't go into so much detail, but the Cultural Heritage Capital Programme the framework basically better how we articulate different elements. And what we published in December was how we describe effectively different assets and what we call cultural services. One of those services is health services. And then what we're building up, as I said, guidance and appraisal and evaluation. The other one is natural capital accounts. This is the document we published in December. It is a build up from our 2021 paper. It's very high level. It kind of shows you what we're defining as assets and services, as I said. A lot more explanation on social cost benefit analysis and natural accounting, which is quite complex thing to get into. And it also sets out our futurist and currently published research as well. And there's an annex there, which is a little bit more of a guide of how to use the work that Professor Fancourt is going to present a bit later on. What I want to say, this is a really crude picture here, which is what we often want to explain this, is that often what happens, as I pointed out in the previous slides, that often what's measured are the costs and tourism and GDP, effectively productivity and growth. What we're trying to do is measure beyond all of those, so use and non-use values, and it's probably a hard explain to unpack those. Education impacts, R&D impacts, volunteer, there's a whole list of benefits we want to look at. Big part of that was health and well-being, and that's what we focused on the project. What we would love to do is have all those benefits all valued in these terms, and we can stack them up against each other and look at different options and different interventions and how they look against costs. And that effectively is the essence of what we're trying to do. And the big part of that, as I said, is what this research focused on was the health and well-being report impacts, and how you put those impacts into monetary values effectively. So in our case, pounds and pence, obviously for others on this call, dollars. And that's where we got to. And this is what I think is one of the kind of first times we've done this using really good evidence base behind it on kind of causal impacts on people. So what you'll find in the thing, we can only focus on a few areas, but we think there's going to be a lot more work we can do in this area. So that's hopefully a useful overview of why we've done this, and hopefully we can start using this to kind of make the case for a lot of cultural and heritage investment.
Thank you so much, Harman. We'll be posting the report as well as Guardian coverage about the report in the chat for those who haven't had a chance to take a look. But I'll pass it on now to Professor Daisy Fancourt to take us into the report detail.
Thank you so much, everyone. Hopefully you can all see my slides okay. It's a real pleasure to be presenting to you today on what we've discovered from working so closely with DCMS and also with Frontier Economics, who have led the economic analyses for this. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the head of the Social Biobehavioural Research Group at UCL, and we are a team that focuses on the impact of our social behaviours on our health. So this is everything from social deficits like loneliness or isolation, through to engagement with social assets, whether that's engagement with arts and culture, broader community groups, social connections, social prescribing, broader leisure activities. And we're really interested in asking how these social connections and behaviours affect our health, what the mechanisms are, who benefits the most, and how we can then actually achieve change so that more people engage in these behaviours. So we do this through 5 main programs of work, which include clinical trials, so randomized control trials of arts and other interventions. But it also a really big part of our work is epidemiology. And this is really what I'm going to be focusing on today, is the research that we've been doing using this epidemiological approach. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. And alongside this, we do lots of mechanistic studies looking at behaviours and particularly biological pathways. But I'm sure many of you are familiar with the report that we published with WHO a number of years ago now, which summarised the findings from over 3,500 studies on the impact of arts and health, both for the management and treatment of illness, as well as for its prevention and promotion. But there was something that we discovered when we were writing this report, there were so many different kinds of studies that had been conducted and that we were able to talk about in the report. But there were several challenges that kept coming up that actually applied to many of these studies. So, for example, the sample size of these studies had often gone into the hundreds or maybe up to around 1,000 people, but it was quite rare to find studies that had multiple thousands of people in them. It was also hard to find studies that had got very long-term data, partly because it's very expensive and complex to continue observing and following people or doing experiments over years or even decades. So we didn't really have much information about how arts engagement might be affecting people if they engage in childhood, but still having effects in middle age or older adulthood. We also were aware that lots of the studies had looked at specific arts interventions or activities designed to have a health impact. And we knew much less about how general engagement day to day, just for the pure pleasure of it, could have health benefits. And also lots of studies that involved arts and health had involved recruiting people, who'd agreed to take part. And we have to be honest that sometimes there can be certain factors that make someone more likely to agree to participate in an arts and health study. Maybe they already engage in the arts or they believe in the benefits of the arts. So we were particularly interested in at having more studies that would have representative samples that would really be generalizable to whole populations, even whole countries. Fortunately, this is where a particular type of study called a cohort study, and this is part of an epidemiological approach, really comes into play. So epidemiology is literally the study of people, and it often involves cohort studies, which are large observational data sets. These are often random samples of a population, so they are actually generalizable to the whole population, let's say adults living in a particular country. And because it's a random sample, you can measure lots and lots of different factors about people. And often these cohorts have got thousands of questions on people's demographics, their economic factors, their education, what they do for their job, all the different ways they spend their spare time, as well as things like personality and mental health, physical health, blood measurements, genetics, incredibly rich data. So within these studies, you end up in a position where naturally amongst the sample, there are some people who might engage in the arts, which we could consider as exposed, versus other people who don't engage. So you end up with sort of two groups that you can extract from this whole sample. And then you can follow these groups up over years or decades and see whether you end up with different kinds of outcomes for those who are engaged in the arts compared to those who aren't. Now, so to date, my team and I have worked with over 24 of these cohort studies all around the world that actually include diverse questions on arts behaviours. And these questions include lots of different things: engagement in performing arts, visual arts and crafts activities, digital and electronic arts, engagement with literature, creative writing and reading, going to cultural events or heritage sites as well. But the challenge with epidemiology is that because you're observing people, you have to consider all the other factors that could explain any potential relationship between arts and a health outcome. And these are called confounders. So it could be that people who engage more in the arts have got different demographics or different economic or educational backgrounds. Maybe they have better health in the first place. Maybe they've got different other kinds of behaviors, like maybe they're more connected socially or have other leisure activities as well as the arts. There could be differences to do with geography, like where they live, what they have access to, the deprivation of the area. And there could even be generational factors, like whether their parents engaged in the arts, whether they had early exposure themselves in life or not, or what the health and situations of their parents were. So within epidemiology, we spend a vast amount of our time theoretically mapping what all of these factors can be and thinking of increasingly sophisticated statistical methods that we can account for all of these factors, essentially build them into our statistical models. And what we're really asking is there still a relationship between arts and health outcomes, even when we've taken account of all of these factors? So I want to give you a flavour of some of the findings that we've had from over a decade now of work on this. And then I'm going to move on to considering what we discovered in our work with Frontier Economics and DCMS on the health economic impact of these findings. So to date, we've published over 100 papers on this from my team alone, and there have been around 50 other papers from other teams in the world. So it's a very sizable body of evidence. So I'm only going to mention a few of the studies, but I will also signpost to where you can find more of them if you're interested. I thought I'd start off with the question of prevention of mental illness, because this is something that actually we knew very little about 10 years ago. There were lots of studies suggesting that engagement in the arts improved symptoms of mental illness, but it's very hard to run prevention studies looking at whether people are likely to develop depression over years or decades. But of course, that's what we can look at in cohort studies where we've got this very long follow-up from people already gathered. So we ran analyses where we looked at creating very rich indices of participation in all kinds of different arts activities, and also engagement with culture. So going to watch events, performances, theatre, carnivals, festivals, whatever. And we looked at how engagement in arts and culture related to levels of mental health 4 years later, even when we'd taken account of what people's baseline mental health was. And as you can see, arts and cultural engagement was associated with lower levels of mental distress, higher levels of mental functioning, and higher levels of life satisfaction 4 years later. And this was even when we'd taken account of very diverse confounding factors. We've also been able to look specifically at whether arts engagement is related to the risk of developing mental illness. This is one example study where we looked at older adults, so adults over the age of 50, and we looked at people who didn't show any indications of currently having depression or previously having had depression, either through clinician assessments or from how they were rating on different clinical scales of depression. And what we found is the more people were engaged in cultural activities, the lower the rate of developing depression over the following 10 years. So this equated to somebody who never engaged in arts and culture, around 5 in every 100 developed depression every year over the following 10 years. Whereas for people who were engaged at least once a month, that rate was only around 2 in every 100. And once we'd taken account of confounders, that equated to almost half the odds of developing depression. We've shown as well that this effect doesn't just happen in countries like the UK, which might have a particular socioeconomic profile or patterning of arts engagements. We published a paper in Nature Medicine a year and a half ago, where we took data from 16 different aging cohorts all around the world, with nearly 100,000 people in total. And we looked at the relationship between creative hobby engagement and various health outcomes 8 years later. And we conducted the analyses for each country independently and then meta-analysed our findings and found there was an overall association between engagement in these creative hobbies and lower depressive symptoms, better self-reported health, higher happiness levels, and higher life satisfaction. As well as looking at mental health, we've also been able to look at aspects of cognition. So, for example, older adults who engage more in activities like going to museums, galleries and exhibitions and the theatre and live music events, they have better levels of memory 10 years later, even when we've taken account of their baseline memory and their broader confounding factors. And this is what we call a dose-response relationship. So the more frequently they're engaged, the better that memory is 10 years later. And we've shown this not just for memory, but for other aspects of cognition as well, like executive function. We've also considered the issue of dementia incidence, and we've created indices within the cohort studies that have looked at whether somebody actually has a formal diagnosis of dementia or whether they are likely to have, they have probable dementia based on how they score on very rich batteries of cognitive assessments that they do as part of the cohort studies. And we've shown that people who engage more in the arts have this lower risk of developing depression over the next 12 years, around 44% lower odds of developing it, again, even when we've taken account of confounders. And this is because we believe that arts engagement helps to build something called cognitive reserve, which is the resilience of the brain against dementia-related decline. So in other words, even if your brain is accumulating pathological symptoms of dementia, it's actually possible to stay symptom-free externally if you have good cognitive reserve. In other words, your brain's able to compensate for longer so that you don't show symptoms for a while longer, even if those symptoms are actually accumulating physically. And in terms of the effect sizes of this, we've actually compared cultural engagement with other activities like frequent socializing, which we know is a risk-reducing factor for developing dementia. And we've shown that it's an almost identical effect size between these two factors, suggesting it's not an insignificant impact that the arts could potentially be having here. And this really builds into a much broader literature that's looked at what we call cognitive leisure activities, so activities that are quite complex and stimulating and really challenge your brain. And to date, studies that have involved over 2 million participants in total have demonstrated that cognitive leisure activities are associated with better preservation of cognition and reduced risk of developing dementia through improved cognitive reserve. We've also been able to look at aspects of physical decline. So again, using these cohort studies, we've created indices of arts and cultural engagement and shown that regular activity for people who have no history of chronic pain is associated with around quarter the odds of developing chronic pain over the next decade. Interestingly, this isn't something that we see for any kind of leisure activity. For example, we haven't found this for broader participation in general social groups or political groups or other kind of community activities, but we have found it for cultural engagement. And again, in terms of the effect size, we see similar effect sizes between arts and cultural engagement and physical activity, a very well-known and accepted health behaviour. We've looked at other aspects of aging like age-related disability, which is impairments in your ability to do things like bath yourself, get yourself dressed, manage your own money, cook your own meals, manage your own medication. These are challenges that can accumulate as people get older. And again, we found that people who are more engaged in cultural activities have a lower risk of developing these problems as they age compared to people who aren't engaged, even when taking account of confounders using various different statistical approaches. Again, the effect sizes are very similar between cultural engagement and physical activity. We've used what's called outcome-wide approaches to try and understand more about some of the mechanisms underlying this. So looking at very diverse aspects of physical function amongst older adults and showing that particularly there are benefits for things like gait speed, so how fast we can walk, balance and sleep, which is of course a major factor involved in all kinds of health-related outcomes, including dementia. And we've also combined lots of these different factors into indices of frailty, which combine cognitive, psychological and physical components. And we've shown that the more culturally engaged people are, the older they tend to be before they start showing symptoms of frailty. So if we imagined a hypothetical person aged 80, they'd be around 1.3 times, have an increased risk of 1.3 times of becoming frail at that age compared to people who are not engaged in cultural activities. We're also increasingly now able to use these cohort studies to understand some of the underlying biological mechanisms that explain some of these results. So using the latest molecular epidemiology approaches, which basically capitalize on very rich biomarker data that are captured within many of these cohort studies, including things like epigenetic data, large panels of thousands of proteins and metabolites within the body. We were actually able to look at this data to estimate people's biological age. So this is the age that their bodies say they are compared to their chronological age, in other words, the number of years since they were born. And we can use this to ascertain if people are aging faster or slower than they should be. We've created physiological clocks that combine various clinical biomarker data, so neurological, cardiovascular, respiratory, hepatic, musculoskeletal and circulatory data. And we've created algorithms that predict people's physiological age based on all of these different factors. We've shown that people who are engaged more in the arts don't necessarily actually feel any younger. They might actually feel at the age that they are, but physiologically, they're around 4 years younger than those people who aren't engaged. And over the next 8 years, they actually age slower. This isn't just a cross-sectional effect. It's a pattern that we observe longitudinally. And using even more sophisticated methods, we've been able to estimate epigenetic age effects. So what this is across our lives, environmental stresses, life experiences can lead to a chemical process which involves adding a methyl group to certain parts of our DNA. And this alters our gene expression. So patterns of this DNA methylation are assessed in epigenetic clocks. So particular patterns can indicate faster epigenetic aging. And we've again found that arts engagement is related to a lower epigenetic age, which is really important because a lower epigenetic age is actually predictive of a longer remaining lifespan and health span, the number of years that we have living in good health. Notably, it's both the frequency and diversity of our arts engagement appears important here. Likely because when we engage in lots of different activities, we're exposing ourselves to different ingredients like social interaction or physical activity or cognitive stimulation or imagination or whatever, each of which has its own benefits to health. And again, when we compare this to physical activity, we're seeing extremely similar effect sizes. All of this helps to explain other findings that we've demonstrated in cohort studies, as have over a dozen other teams around the world, showing that when people engage more in the arts, they actually have an increased likelihood of living longer. So all of these effects are building quite a rich picture about how at a population level, engagement in arts and culture could have benefits for helping to maintain better well-being and mental and physical functioning. We published a report that summarized all of the findings from our first 5 years of this work back at the end of 2022. And we're planning to update this shortly, as we've published many more papers in the 3 years since then. But what I really want to now consider is how we've used this data with Frontier Economics and DCMS to try and put figures on some of these things, because whilst it can be really interesting to talk about percentage reductions, from a policy perspective, what's really important is to consider, well, if we're seeing these reductions in depression incidence or frailty or pain or whatever, what are the savings from this? Well, what impact is this having more broadly economically on society? So 18 months ago, we began a collaboration with DCMS and Frontier Economics to try and monetize some of these preventative benefits for health and well-being. And the aim of this was to try and ensure, as Harry mentioned, that cultural, economic and social benefits of culture and heritage are better monetized within economic analyses, so that we're not undervaluing the arts and culture within policy decisions. So the way that we did this is, first of all, collaborating on a literature review, which involved selecting epidemiological papers that had shown effects just like the ones I've just reported to you, that could be turned into health economic values through creating a monetary value algorithm. And in particular, there were 3 different factors that were focused on within this report. The first of which was looking at the individual health economic impact. So what was the benefit to the individual? And in the report, we looked at this in 2 ways. A QALY, which is a quality adjusted life year. It's a measure that combines both the quality and quantity of life lived. So 1 QALY represents 1 year lived in perfect health. And the other way was a WellBe. This is a well-being year. And it's a measure of subjective well-being that captures how people think and feel about their lives. So in other words, if you've got higher WellBes, that corresponds to increased life satisfaction. The other thing that was considered in this report was broader health and social care impacts. So for example, where NHS treatment costs had been potentially avoided due to people engaging in arts and culture. And the final thing was productivity impact. So this was calculating the impact of arts and cultural engagements in terms of helping people engage more in employment or also in unpaid productivity, like having more time for volunteering or labour within the home. So to do this, Frontier Economics identified a number of papers, a large number of which came from the ones that my team and I have published, like the ones I've just presented. We'd initially hoped we could do this for all the different aspects of arts, culture and heritage. But in fact, no, there are only some of these where we have the kind of epidemiological data that I've just spoken about with longitudinal follow-up. So we ended up focusing on creative, participating in arts and cultural activities and also creative engagement. But we still have less on things like the built historic environment and engagement with heritage. And then alongside this literature review, we used data from the Taking Part survey, which is a survey that looks and estimates engagement and participation numbers in arts, culture, and other kinds of leisure activities. So this gave a sense of how many people are actually engaging within the UK. And then we applied these 3 different, looked at these 3 different aspects of health economics in order to estimate the benefits per person and also society-wide. Now, what we show in the report is that there are very diverse findings that were being found for each of the papers that we looked at. You know, the benefits of these for the individual range from a few £100 up to £1,300 per year, and the societal benefits go up to £8 billion per year for each paper that we looked at. Now, because these analyses were done by paper, there is some overlap, so we can't simply add these figures together and say this is the whole health economic impact of arts engagement in the country. But what they do tell us is they monetize different types of outcomes in different populations. So what I want to do is just to give you a flavor of a few of these findings. But of course, some of these papers will be more relevant to people for different areas of work that they might be involved in. So I thought I'd focus particularly on mental health, given that's some of the findings that I've already presented to you today. So for these analyses 2A and B, we used one of the papers that I showed you at the start of this presentation, where we'd looked at the relationship between arts engagement, cultural participation, and different aspects of mental health. Now, this was a study that had used data from 25,000 people tracked over 4 years, and it included extremely rich types of arts and cultural participation, which is really important. So we weren't just focusing on one activity, but considering the very many different ways that people might be engaging in the arts. And it used a very sophisticated approach to take account even of confounders we might not have been able to identify or measure, and factors like genetics as well. And what Frontier Economics then did is to use the taking part data to estimate, well, how many people actually did these activities or do these activities per year. So they estimated that there were around 3.2 million people who had attended a cultural event and around 9.8 million who had participated in the arts. Now, this was just focusing on the particular age range that we had in our analysis, which was aged 30 to 49. So just a limited age range amongst adults. And overall, the economic analyses, when they considered these individual and productivity benefits, suggested that there were annual per person economic benefits of £650 per person and societal benefits of £2 billion. Personally, I have to say, I think we're even potentially underestimating here because we didn't include any potential NHS or social care savings within this particular analysis, but always much better to be conservative than the other way around. Now, as I mentioned, this was just for adults who were aged 30 to 49. But in fact, our analyses have suggested there could be similar benefits for adults of all ages. So what Frontier Economics has also done is consider, well, if these findings were extrapolated to include all adults over the age of 18, what would those cost savings be? And we can see here that the mental health benefits that I've just mentioned are estimated at around £5 billion to society each year and around £10 billion from participating in the arts to society each year. These results are proportional, which means that hypothetically, if we could double the number of people who attend cultural activities, you could expect to see similar increases in the economic benefits that are being described here. And I also just included as well one of the other papers that I haven't spoken about today, but it looked at how engagement in arts is related to general health. So this is a non-specific index that takes account of broader mental and physical functioning. And you can see that the analyses just for this one paper alone were suggesting benefits of £18 billion per year. So some really sizable effects here. I'm not going to go too much more into the specific findings in the report because I want us to have a chance for discussion in the session as well. So I'm just going to point you to the report itself if you'd like to see the findings from the other papers that were in there. Overall, I hope you'll agree that this is a really important and practical report because it does provide the first methods for being able to calculate the health economic impact of arts engagement at population levels. And we really hope this is just the start of the work that we can do with DCMS and Frontier Economics to understand the health economic impact of the arts. I think I want to end with a sort of word of hope and a word of caution from these findings. The first is that these results really show the value of continuing work to engage people in the arts. I think especially those who are hard to reach. We know at the moment that we were estimating participation using the Taking Part survey in the UK, but we know that many of the people who don't engage in the arts are people who might be facing barriers, economic barriers or health-related barriers. And actually our analyses suggest that these are the people who could benefit the most from arts engagement. They tend to have even greater health and mental and physical health benefits from engagement. So I think it's really demonstrating the value of helping to engage more people from all backgrounds in the arts, and that this does have, or this could potentially have, these health economic benefits. But I think my warning here, my worry is that because we've seen so many cuts to arts and cultural budgets over the last decade, we know this has affected participation. And it's likely this is not only just affecting people's ability to engage, but also their health and also having health economic consequences. But that's also why I think this report is really important, giving us a way that we can start to monetize some of those effects. So overall, I hope that in tangent with the work that's happening, not just in health, but also demonstrating the benefits of the arts within education, with employment, tourism, criminal justice, and society more generally, all of this will help us to understand more deeply the societal value of the arts. So just to point you to these reports, they're all available or linked through our website, and we'll be able to circulate the links to these as well. And I'd just love to acknowledge my colleagues at Frontier Economics who led the health economics work for this, and also DCMS for commissioning this in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy. I think it's over to me now. I'm Nils. Nisha kindly introduced me at the head of this this webinar. I work at WHO Europe, and I'm also a co-founder, co-creator of the Jameel Arts Health Lab. And first of all, a huge thanks to you, Daisy and Harry, for your two fantastic presentations. The information per se isn't new to me, but these I'm always still kind of knocked over by these presentations. So I think the amount of information that you're gathering, how you present it, the compellingness of the argument, I think it just gets better and better every time I hear it. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing this with us. We have about 20 minutes or so, maybe even a little bit longer, to start a conversation here, and that's really what these community of practice sessions are supposed to be about. So I'm very keen to take questions from the floor. If you want to ask them in the chat, I'm also going to try to scan the chat for those. Tessa is also there answering questions diligently. So let's try and have a conversation about this. I know there was one question from the chat, which I thought was a really interesting one by Julia Kendick. And I asked if you might want to ask this question yourself. Maybe you'd like to raise your hand, because I think it's a really important one. Otherwise, I'm happy to paraphrase you, but I also don't want to put you on the spot. Oh, there you are. Fantastic, Julie. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. But I get so nervous. So
yes, I understand.
I just am curious about the bounds of the definition around cultural engagement and what we might do to expand that definition and begin looking at cultures that have practices that are integral to our everyday life. It's not in our spare time. It's not an add-on. It's not something that we have to travel to or buy a ticket to, but nonetheless are very important cultural happenings in our, I'll speak for myself as an Indigenous person native to, a native in the U.S., living in the U.S. I'm Jalagi, and so that's kind of part of what, what I'm wondering. How can we expand? The research is incredible, and Daisy, thank you so much. And I wonder if there are opportunities to kind of expand and look more closely at cultures that are integral to this idea.
This is such an important question. A lot of the research that we've done when it's been in the UK, it always depends on what questions are available within the cohort studies. So within the UK, we've been lucky with some of the cohort studies that they have been quite diverse in terms of what they've asked about. So they've included things like engagement with carnivals, with culturally specific dance activities, for example. They've included quite diverse activities that might sometimes be considered at the fringe of traditional art definitions, but are very important within certain communities. So things like street arts, for example, and other youth arts cultures. But there is always a challenge here that sometimes the questions don't capture every kind of arts practice. We've increasingly started working with international cohort studies, so studies from different countries, where actually the questions have often been designed to better reflect the practices within those particular countries. So we've just started working with a cohort study in Malawi, for example, which asks specifically about engagement with the arts in the context of village rituals and meetings, where that is an organic part of daily life. And we've also been collaborating with a new study from the US, which is called the Global Flourishing Study, where we have new questions that are designed to capture broader arts practices in 22 countries around the world. But this is also part of a broader mission that we have, which is to try and raise awareness about the importance of having arts questions within these cohort studies. Often in the past, these questions were added in somewhat randomly because the cohorts were designed to try and be diverse, but they weren't designed with local artists or with people who are cultural custodians within their communities and understand how to talk about arts practices. So we're trying to now encourage some of these cohort studies to expand the questions that they have on the arts within them, so that we can include that much broader and much more representative picture of arts and cultural engagement in different cultures.
Thanks very much, Daisy. Go ahead. Yeah, Harry,
Nils, I just wanted to add to that answer from Daisy. So it's really worth saying that the kind of your question is a brilliant one, by the way, because it's something we talk about quite a lot, not just within this project on the health side, but actually more generally on our projects, is how do we actually understand those different outcomes and elements for different groups. And it's an area that we need to look at, because what you often find in some of the economic methodologies, they can be very average based. They don't take account of different people. And also they're budget constrained as well, right? So, a value of a pound is not worth the same for everybody. And so there are techniques that we can start applying to those, such as what we call welfare weighting and equity weighting, which we're interested in looking at. But on your specific question around especially Indigenous groups, one of the areas that we're really interested in looking at is intangible heritage. And how do we go about measuring intangible heritage and valuing that in the same kind of economic technique? So less on the health side, but more the general kind of value of those areas. So it's on our list of things to do, and we want to do that in the future. And I was at the WHO conference on wellbeing in Rome end of last year, and actually it was really interesting seeing other countries bringing that into their health and wellbeing frameworks when there were specific Indigenous groups in their country. So that was really interesting. And actually, I just had a conversation with an economist from the Welsh government, actually, and they were talking about how do we protect, how do we value languages and things like that. So I think there's some definite work we can do in that area.
Thanks very much, Harry. Can I do a quick follow-up on this question, because I think it's so rich, and at the same time I don't want us to just speak about this, but while I appreciate the kind of huge diversity of what cultural engagement and arts engagement means to different people and different populations, is there also is there a need to define some consistency there, some principle, for instance, around aesthetic engagement or creativity that that differentiates, I guess, arts or cultural engagement from other types of social engagement, including sports, or is that too kind of narrow-minded, perhaps, and too square?
Well, my view on this is that the arts and all leisure activities contain various active ingredients. So some of these are quite general and apply to things, not just arts, but other leisure, like social interaction, physical activity, some kind of cognitive stimulation. But then there are particular ingredients that are more specific to the arts, or particularly strongly expressed in the arts. So things like creativity, imagination, often multisensory stimulation at once, beauty and aesthetics, as you mentioned. So I quite like this ingredients approach, because it doesn't say that you have to categorize things. Some things might be in multiple categories. For example, ice skating, if you're doing choreographed ice skating, that is technically considered a sport, but that's also a dance. That is also an arts activity. There are things like baking, where you are, again, focused on that same process of creativity and imagination, and things like gardening, growing flowers as well, where you've got those same elements. Again, within cohort studies, we do come down to which questions have been asked, but that's why in some of the work that I presented earlier, we have included things like baking, like gardening, and like magic tricks, like circus arts within those definitions, even if sometimes they wouldn't have appeared in your dictionary definition of what an art form is, because we have recognized that they actually do have very, very similar or even identical constellations of active ingredients.
And just to add to Daisy's work. So one of the things we also did alongside the report was we published, I'll just put it on the side there, it's called Embedding Cultural Heritage Capital. And so that does some of that kind of heavy lifting slightly. It's still very prototypey. So what we call it, so that cultural heritage capital is a concept in terms of a systems-based approach, like natural capital. So what we had to do in that is to start defining what we meant by cultural services. So Daisy, as Daisy said, that does have things like, actually, some of those services are inspirational services. So how do we unpack the words behind that? Communal services. We also have health services in there. But what was really interesting is when you start looking across those services, many of them then do lead to health outcomes. And that's where we have another table that says, actually, these services do lead to health outcomes or well-being outcomes or growth outcomes as well, so economic growth outcomes. But what we have tried to do is use those words that you use to go, actually, these can be put into this, this prism. So we have one called aesthetic services, which brings in beauty and things like that. So it's worth having a look at that document, because we're trying to formalize that a little bit more. The difficult thing is we've got an assets list as well, but you get into that issue and trying to we're even an open door here, because sometimes it is up to people themselves to define what their cultural assets are. And also the important thing, we found this with working on the City of Culture, Coventry, and other cities of culture. What we found is the best way to get people's participation to change is you co-produce with them, right? And it's probably obvious for everyone on this call, but it's one of the most important things we found, to get people to tell you what they want and what they think culture is. Because a lot of the definitions that we have, such as going to the theatre, actually doesn't pick up all the things that people are doing, say, within their own communities and religious groups, for example, where they see that as culture as well. So that's where you need a broadening of that. But that's where it's going to be very participatory with communities in trying to bring that data and information out, which it's exactly what Daisy said in her presentation as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Harry. So the chat is getting very lively. I have to make a confession that the chat is very far away from me, and I find it a little bit difficult to read. So I'd love to encourage those of you who feel that you can ask the question in the group to just raise your hand. And we have time, and I'll definitely I'll draw on you. It would make things a little bit easier. But for now, anyway, I'm just going to try to go through the chat here. And one of the questions we have, when I say raise the hand, I saw one of you actually raising it. I'm not going to be able to see that, unfortunately. You would need to try and do that via the react button at the bottom of Zoom. If you click on that, there should be a raise hand feature, and then I can pick you up in the chat. But there was a question here. Again, this is probably directed more at you, Daisy, about but Harry, please feel free to jump in, about the creative art therapies, or art therapies in particular, and the degree to which those are also reflected with or not within the report. If there's anything one can say about the economic value of creative art therapies.
I'm going to share my screen, actually, because I had a slide on this, but I took it out last minute in the interest of time, but clearly I should have left it in. The report actually does specifically include health economic analyses around arts therapies as well. This is
Uh-oh.
What a cliffhanger.
What a cliffhanger. Is there, Harry, is there anything you can say?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to steal Daisy's thunder.
I think I got booted out.
She's back.
There we are. You're back. Okay.
I'm not quite sure what happened there. I'll try again. But yeah, this actually showed that there were benefits again to individuals and also societal benefits from this. And it also, one of the things I really liked about this analysis was there was what's called a what if scenario. So this imagined, well, if we could increase the number of individuals who have new cancer diagnoses who actually receive visual arts therapy, what would the health economic consequences of this be? What would the benefits be? And you can see some very sizable, large numbers of millions of pounds of benefits here, which I think is a really exciting thing to be able to show in terms of then considering what the payback could be from investing more in those visual arts therapy delivery and the visual arts therapists who do that delivery.
Thanks, Daisy. Harry, did you want to add to that?
No, nothing about. But I think, yeah, I just said this was one of the areas I think, Daisy, we kind of really looked in to add to the report, and it was a really interesting piece of work. And I know there's plenty more we can do in that space as well. So I think there'll be some expansions in the future. But I think what was really good with that work, it then brought us more into the kind of evidence at that kind of more clinical level as well, which was really useful, rather than just day-to-day participation. So that's one of the areas I'd be really keen to kind of see us build on in the future.
Great. So we do have a hand up. Monica Jakubiak, I don't think we can see you. Your camera doesn't seem to work, but please go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry, my camera, I don't know, it's just my camera. But so first of all, thank you very much. This conversation is really interesting, and I came across it by accident on LinkedIn. I'm an artist, a creative practitioner, and my question is for Daisy. I've never taken any part in the research, which which I'm hearing about today. However, what you're saying, I've been running creative workshops for about 20 years in about 17 countries. I have 2 careers, so this is not my full-time job, but what you are talking about, I see it firsthand. So my question to you is like, how can a person like me, an art actually, hands-on person, how can I take part in the research like that? Or how can I learn or educate myself more even about, I'm not a therapist, but I'm a creative facilitator. And I think I know that for people being actively creative or engaging with the arts again, so not being passive in creativity, changes outlook on life. So
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a big thank you, and questions like, how can I get involved?
Yeah.
Providing body of real evidence.
Great.
Thank
Daisy.
you for that question. And in fact, that ties in with another question that I saw in the chat, which is about how artists have been involved in this research itself. So with all of our epidemiological research, we have PPI groups. So we involve artists, members of the public in decisions around how we're designing our research questions and how we're going about and interpreting the analyses. The data sets themselves are large-scale cohort studies. So an easy way is if you ever get invited to be part of a cohort study, definitely say yes. There's a big one at the moment in the UK called Our Future Health, which is recruiting. Unfortunately, it doesn't include questions on arts, that one. But I think these cohort studies rely on the generosity of people being happy to take part and answer questions and give blood samples or whatever over many years. There is also a broader way, if you're interested though in getting involved more in research around this, which is to join one of the networks like the Culture, Health and Wellbeing Alliance in the UK, the National Organisation for Arts and Health in the US. I'm sure that the Jameel Arts and Health people on the chat will be able to provide links to lots of these within the chat itself. But these are really wonderful because they have regular newsletters where they'll provide details about opportunities for artists and arts organisations to be involved in research. They'll run networking events and days where you can meet other practitioners and researchers. So I think that joining that kind of ecosystem is a really fantastic way of learning more and being able to take part.
Thanks very much, Daisy, and thanks, Monica, for the question. So I'm going to keep encouraging you to raise your hand, let your voice be heard. In the meantime, I'm going to take another question from the chat, which is more to you, Harry, I think, and maybe a little bit in parallel to the question of arts and health. But I think it's a valid question about the data. You were mentioning before that you're trying to look more broadly at the economic value of arts and culture. And maybe can you say a little bit more about where you are at with that? If there are other reports on that are forthcoming, any other detail would be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So what we've got, and the document I posted before has a lot of this in big tables. But what we've been doing, and it's using a technique called and some contingent valuation, which is basically asking people how they value attendance in the theatre or museums. Now, it's part of the guidance we do. We use it, but that's one way of doing it. But the problem with that, it can be a very black box sometimes. So you don't know what people are valuing, and what we're doing is trying to understand what's actually within those values, and therefore what we're not capturing in that work. That's what we call kind of the use values. The other area that we're looking at is what we call non-use values. These are the things that people still value a lot of the cultural and heritage offers or assets. In the case of intangible heritage that exists, they may actually never actually engage with it, but they still value it, and they value that being kept for future generations. So we've got another technique that values that going into the future. That's the piece we're doing at the moment to actually help people understand how they can apply that work. And then we have a number of other methods that work on. We're also doing some more work on how we actually value cultural education, And we're hoping in the next year to have a bit more guidance on helping people actually, if you are delivering or investing in or have an intervention where you want to measure the economic impact, that's kind of the usual kind of jobs impact, GDP impact, and we want to kind of how to do that, because we always find it's kind of hard to do without hiring a massive group of economists to do. So we want to kind of help people understand how it's done and what to ask for. So we are looking at across a range of different outcomes at the moment, and understanding how we value them. Some of those already exist, by the way. So, for example, our obviously the Department of what we call DEFRA, our environment, has lots of values on the environmental impact. Our the Home Office, who looks at crime, they've got lots of values already where if you're changing impacts on crime, you can look at what the impact of that is as well. So our job is trying to bring this together and do new research, because we don't want to kind of copy what other people have done. The trick is, though, is how to make it more cultural relevant as well. And that needs work such as the work that Daisy's been doing to kind of take the kind of concepts of health and health economics and bring it together and focus on the health side. So that's what we're doing. We have a big list of that in the back of our document to help. But actually, we're also interested to hear from other people. We really want to know what you need as well. And that will help us kind of focus on where we need to go in the future. So we want to hear from people go, well, actually, I really need this value. I really need to value this impact. How do I do it? Could you do some work on that? And that's what we want to hear from people. Our work is here to help everyone on this call. It's not just for us. So that's why we want to hear from other people what they need, where we can best help.
Thanks. Great. That's fantastic to hear. Thanks for that generous reaching out as well, Harry. So it looks like my call for hands has been answered, and we've got a few lined up here. And I'm going to go to Kate. I'm going to go to you first.
Hi, everyone. Oh, thank you so much. This is so very exciting, and there's so much information, almost overwhelmingly such. And one thing I just want to say, I'm so grateful for all the work that you're doing and helping us to create language around what for many years we always think that it's magic. It's magic what's happening, but it's science, and it's really we can show it now. It's measurable, and it's very exciting now to also have language to talk to the different disciplines, from the arts to health to government. So thank you for all of this work. One question that I have is a rather practical question: is how can I access some of these cohort studies that are relevant to the work that I'm doing? That's one question. And also another is, in the US right now, we're just finally getting a grip on social prescribing. And I would like to get my organization that has 10 years of experience of making music in population of folks that are dealing with homelessness. How do I become one of the groups that the social prescribing entities can be prescribed to? So how can I get on that list of people of places that people get recommended to do a music group?
Thanks, Kate. I wonder, Nisha, if you feel like you can say a few words about that. I know social prescribing has crossed the lab's horizon also on several occasions. And since you're based in the US, maybe you can provide some thoughts.
Sure. I was actually just on a call earlier this morning, but with our Scottish colleagues, about how they're moving towards a social prescribing framework across Scotland. In the US, we have actually a couple of studies that we can share in the chat about the reality of social prescribing in the US, the state of that work. It's also led by our colleague Jill Sonke at the Epi Arts Lab at the Center for the Arts and Medicine at University of Florida, another member of our steering committee. And it depends on the state that you're in. So Kate, what state are you in?
I'm in California, in Los Angeles.
Okay, so I can't speak with great wisdom about the status of social prescribing in California at the moment. I can provide you with links to case examples of Massachusetts, the activities that are now emerging in New York. I can say for California that there's a private company by the name of Arts Pharmacy that's been partnering with Stanford and other groups to pilot a way of facilitating social prescribing, where they take care of the technical end, providing the link worker, which is what it would be called in the UK, but somebody who's an intermediary linking health providers with cultural assets. cultural providers. So their business takes care of that referral link and the follow-up with people who have been referred by their providers to seek out this particular cultural engagement for their known health benefits. So I know that there's activity happening in California. I think it's happening in these pilot phases. It's certainly not statewide, and ideally we move towards a strategy state by state, potentially even federally, although that would assume any kind of federal response to healthcare. I will leave my comments to the side for the rest of that. But I think that there are some hopeful movements. Happy to stay in touch about that. And I see that Tess is already sharing links in the chat connected to what I was just sharing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nisha. Yeah, and thank you, Kate, for the question. We are actually beginning to run out of time. So let's take let's maybe take 3 questions here, the 3 hands next, and then see if we can answer them between our panelists. So maybe Michelle, if you want to ask your question first, and then Marlies, I'll ask you, and Sally, I'll ask you last. Michelle.
I'm Michelle Debaugh, and I work with women over the age of 40 who have fibromyalgia, sometimes MS, lupus. And one of the big things I advocate is fibromyalgia neuroaesthetics. And I guess my big question is, where are we going on a digital basis? Because I deal a lot with women who have health, physical and mental challenges, and so getting to somewhere sometimes is very difficult in this field. And so really creating things like junk journaling and making seed packets and gardening and all that stuff is really important, because that's part of neuroaesthetics, but also have to do it oftentimes in a digital way. So I'm just kind of curious if there's been any studies on the digital aspect of arts and health.
Great question, Michelle. We'll park that for a moment. Marlies, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm following from Harry, a question that you said, what do we need? And also a conversation that, Julie, that you brought to us, and Nils, when you spoke about categorizing the arts. I'm based in South Africa, and we are pioneering arts and health. It's not an established field at all, and there's a lot of advocacy to be done. However, we've inherited a kind of a harmful narrative around kind of higher arts, going to the theatre and museums and all these activities as imposed and quite exclusive and inaccessible. And so the work really is about recentering these innate cultural practices of the arts that we see as people open circles and dance at events and kind of innate expressions of the arts. And so I like this idea of measuring cultural assets, maybe creative and cultural assets, but really a need for more of these studies from a global South perspective, and that looks at innate and the indigenous expressions of the arts. Daisy, please come over to Africa.
Thank you so much, Marlies. Great point, and we'll get a thought on that in a second. But first, maybe Sally, do you want to ask your question as well?
Hello, thank you very much. Yes, I am a creative health manager working in both mental and general health trusts in the UK, in the middle of the UK. And I have lots of frustrating conversations with colleagues who hold budgets, who agree that the arts are good for us, but they have millions of pounds to save each financial year. And the trouble that I'm having is trying to articulate the impacts that the research is demonstrating, and how we can kind of quantify that within the framework of finance in hospitals. So I had a conversation earlier this week with a commissioner who was very much on board, and he said, well, no, there's no large scale research on this topic, And, you know, we all know innately that it's good for us, but I've got to save £130 million this year. So I can't just chuck money at this stuff if I can't be sure that it works. It's really frustrating. And I guess the difficulty that I'm having is being able to access the data in a way that is meaningful and that will make people take notice and invest. Because otherwise we have to find the money to do the work, and to do the work we have to have the evidence base. So it's a little bit of a conundrum. So it's just really the question is around, is there a resource somewhere that we can access this information in order to be able to articulate it simply to our colleagues? Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Lots of good questions. Maybe I start with the last one first. Sally's question of where are the resources that we can use to articulate? And maybe I can kick off by saying I think there is no kind of one-stop shop yet, or like one document, one publication, one policy brief that I think solves all our issues. But there is a collection of key documents, I guess, or key reports that are making that case. And one of them, if I may, is a plug back to the WHO report, the 2019 report, which I think has been very useful in convincing at least policymakers, but in many cases also hospital managers and others, that there is the evidence base is there and is growing and is getting stronger. So that's one thing I would say. I would also say that, I mean, the report from DCMS is another critical piece in that puzzle, right? So taking that report, putting it under somebody's nose, and then quoting that £8 billion pound figure should at least get somebody's attention. So I think these kinds of these publications are there and are ready to use. Also on our side at WHO, together with Daisy, Nisha, the lab, and Jill, we're trying to make this case that that Daisy has been presenting to you about the epidemiological evidence. We're trying to bring that to a global scale and to global attention. So we're also hopeful that in the next few years we'll produce a follow-up report to the 2019 one that will reiterate the messaging that Daisy, her team, and the research community around this are putting out. So maybe I can park that question. We only have a couple of minutes more to go. And I would maybe ask you, Harry, to reflect on the comment that we had about the global South and the kind of evidence base, or rather the practices that are maybe that are in the global South that we're maybe not picking up on. I don't know if you have any thoughts or reflections on that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think Daisy, actually you touched on this in your presentation or one of your comments, that the data and impact will be very different across different countries, and therefore you sometimes need specific countries. And we know this from the work we've done on other studies, where the value that people have for different types of cultural engagement is very, very different. You know, the classic one is opera has a higher value amongst a bigger set of people than other countries where it's less seen as high. It's seen as something people do every day, and that will vary across countries. And obviously the problem with that is, as you start needing more studies, the costs escalate. And so I think one of our kind of challenges is how we can help some of these values and these studies actually transfer to other groups. So a good example of that, Daisy made the point that we on one of the studies we had a very smaller age group, and Frontier Economics allowed us to expand that a little bit more with a bit more work, so we could expand to different age groups. I think on that, and obviously I do talk to a few South African economists. There's a few very, very big names down there, and hopefully I'll meet them hopefully in the summer as well. So I think we'd be very interested in hearing in that. We obviously are a UK focus at the moment because it's building into UK guidance, but we are always interested in hearing what other people are doing, because cultural economics is quite a small field. That's why we've got some brilliant people from the health economics have come into this project. But the more we can bring in, the more we can get data, more we can get evidence to build these up, because it's quite a small cohort of data. I think someone mentioned before. The more we can build up from other countries, I think would be really useful as well, and hopefully see whether that actually can be used in other countries as well. Because as I said, there's likely to be slight differences in application and people's value of culture as well.
Thanks so much, Harry. So we have one final, that's the final question about the digital space. I don't know, Daisy, if you feel like you can, I don't actually know if Daisy's still on the call. Daisy, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I was brought a delicious
Oh,
biscuit by a child, so I turned my camera off to eat it.
Okay. Would you like to just share some thoughts on that question?
Yes, absolutely. We've actually run some studies where we've directly compared through cohort data engagement in participatory arts versus doing it online, like engagement in virtual choirs versus real choirs. We actually do tend to see lots of benefits from online engagement, but one of the main challenges is that for some people, online engagement is wonderful and they feel really immersed. For other people, it feels very artificial and they can't get their head in the game, so to speak, with it. So we do find there's a lot more variability in people's health benefits from online engagement compared to in-person. And naturally, you're only getting some of the active ingredients that I mentioned earlier, like you won't be getting the same in-person socializing or perhaps the physical activity that might have got you out of the house and having those new experiences outside of your own home. So I think it always has to be a balance between whether this is the best way for someone to engage because there are no local activities or it meets their own personal or health needs versus whether there are opportunities for people also to have real life engagement too.
Thank you, Daisy. All right, we've run out of time. In fact, we are over time, and there's so much more to be said. We will have other opportunities. I'll pass back to Nisha in a moment to conclude. I'd like to say thanks again to our panel members, to our audience. Absolutely, thank you for listening in. We also had some very good input. Joseph, you mentioned that it would be good to hear from patients as well. This is the first of our webinars, so I think this is feedback that we're definitely taking on board and we'll think about for a next webinar. So thank you for everybody who participated, for all of your comments and thoughtful questions. And Nisha, I'll hand over back to you.
I'll just share and echo that thanks. Thank you for all of your wonderful contributions to a very rich conversation. Our next conversation will be on February 21st at the same time. You'll be able to register through links in our social media or you'll receive notice if you sign up for the newsletter, which you can do through our website. That one will focus on mapping cultural assets in different countries and communities. We'll be looking at case examples from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, Singapore, India, and Scotland. And, this really goes to that question of, where are these cultural assets? Who's doing this work? What do we valorize as this work, arts and health work? It goes a little bit to Julie's question in terms of valorizing cultural and community practices and how these can be mobilized, invested in, supported, reinforced, amplified as part of what contributes to our health and well-being. So with that, I'll end. Thank you, Nils. Thank you, Tessa. Thank you to our speakers, Harry and Daisy. Thank you to all of you. We'll see you next time.